magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and in this video I'm going to be talking about how to play Ynnari effectively in 9th edition Warhammer 40k. Now, those of you who are very new to 9th ed may not already know that the Ynnari are a band of Eldari doomsday cultists. Their raison d'etre is to awaken the Eldari god of death, whom they believe will one day kill Slaanesh, and free all previously lost Eldar souls from the torments of the warp. In theory, this would restore Eldari reincarnation and eventually enable space elves to once again dominate the galaxy as they did before the fall. Now, on the 9th edition tabletop, the Ynnari technically count as a craft world, with access to the same two faction bonuses, Strands of Fate and Battle Focus, that all Asuryani benefit from, as well as the same stratagems and relics, and they, in addition, have their own custom sub-faction bonuses. They're basically a custom craft world. They have the ability to fight first in melee, and they get +1 to hit for any unit that is below its starting strength. In addition, Ynnari detachments can also include Harlequins and certain Drukhari units, so long as there are at least as many craft worlds units with the same battlefield role as those being pulled from the other two factions. So if, for example, you want to include some Drukhari Reavers in a list, you would need at least one Craft Worlds fast attack unit. And then if you wanted to add the Harlequin Spikes, you would need another Craft Worlds fast attack unit, and then it becomes difficult to fit things into detachments. So it's very cool that Ynnari have access to Drukhari and Harlequins, but any Harlequins in a Ynnari list do not have access to Luck of the Laughing God, and they cannot take pivotal roles, while Drukhari do not benefit from Power from Pain, their big faction bonus, and they can't take upgrades like Chosen Retinue. So there are some limitations. Lastly, although Ynnari detachments cannot include Asuryani named characters like Phoenix Lords, they do have access to the 3 Ynnari named characters Yvraine, aka Cat Lady, the Yinkarn, aka the Avatar of the God of Death, and the Vizsark, aka probably just Casey Jones from the Ninja Turtles in a different helmet. So let's talk about what makes Ynnari effective on the table. And they are, as it turns out, effective on the table. Back in March, when I reviewed the then recently released Eldari Codex, I declared that Ynnari had been firmly relegated to casual play with the new rules, a mediocre combination of sub-faction bonuses compared to what was available to other Craft Worlds lists, along with limitations on how players could soup in Drukhari and Harlequins that I just referred to, led me to conclude that while the Yinkarn is fabulous, there was just no good reason for a competitive player to ever select Ynnari over several other Craft Worlds options, or perhaps Harlequins. I was wrong, and sometimes it is gratifying to be wrong. Over the past few months, a number of Ynnari lists have put in impressive performances at GTs both in Europe and in the US, in some cases landing on the winner's podium. For at least a couple of weeks, Ynnari were the most statistically high-performing Craft Worlds list after Hail of Doom, if they are essentially a Craft World. So to be fair to me, though, there have been some nerfs to Harlequins and certain Craft Worlds builds, especially Hail of Doom, since my initial review. But nevertheless, what I totally overlooked, and what Utah-based Ynnari player Chase Chappell did not, is the absolutely brutal Alpha Strike potential of Death Elves, if we stop being distracted by how they were clearly meant to be played thematically by the designers, and focus instead on some curious synergies made possible with very select unit souping and psychic powers. Although Chase Chappell is not the only one winning with Ynnari at the moment, it is easy to see his influence in the other Death Elf lists that have been performing well. The fundamental concept behind these builds is to maximize Alpha Strike mortal wound output in order to leave opponents scrambling to recover from an initial nose-breaking face jab, while a host of pointy-eared doomsayers merrily dominates the midboard and sweeps the objective game, which is often very challenging for Craft Worlds because we're fragile. In this article, or in this case, video, if you want to read a text-based version of this, head over to my website. I often include in the videos digressions and additional thoughts and off-topic nonsense, but the text-based version is there. So in this video, I will consider why these lists are so successful and how to build your own unique variant that will enable you to dust off your Ynnari and brutalize the tables at your friendly local game store for the first time since Soulburst made Dark Reapers the most hated unit in all of 40k. So let's talk about building an Alpha Strike Ynnari list. Death Elf Prophet Chase Chappelle has been through a number of builds since Warzone Nephilim and various rules updates have altered the playing field and the meta, but there are certain units that appear pretty consistently both in his lists and the winning rosters of those Chappellian disciples who have followed in his footsteps. These are the Ynnari. Why would you build a Ynnari list without the Ynnari? A Hemlock Wraithfighter with the Revenant discipline that is Ynnari Psychic Power, Storm of Whispers, a Drukhari Voidraven Bomber, and at least one Falcon. And that's cool because some of those units were otherwise not seeing a ton of play in competitive 40k. Also included in these lists are either 2 Farseers or a Farseer plus a Shadowseer, a Warlock Conclave, a unit of Striking Scorpions with Crushing Blows, at least 1 unit of Howling Banshees that has Piercing Strike and the Crone Scream. And I will acknowledge too that although that combo of additional units appears in Chappelle's competitive lists, it also appears in the vast majority of Asuryani competitive lists from any craft world because they're just so freaking good. And then the standard troops package for the Ynnari list seems to be 2 units of Rangers to play the midfield and 1 unit of cheap Cabalites to hide on a home objective. No upgrades, just naked torture elves hiding in the backfield, showing each other dirty pictures and doing whatever denizens of the Dark City do when they are waiting out a battle sitting on an objective. In addition to all of these units I just mentioned, about all of these lists also seem to include 3D cannons in a single unit, which that's been more popular in Craft World's lists lately. I took a trio of them to my last GT and they were not bad. A player who wants to include all of those units, if you're going to go with that core package, you have about 275 points left to play with. Variants of this list usually spend those points on some combination of Shining Spears, Shroud Runners, Swooping Hawks, and in one curious instance, Bahareth. Bizarrely, it is possible to sneak a Phoenix Lord into a Ynnari force by adding one as the only unit in an auxiliary support detachment. When I first saw this list on Best Coast Pairings, I was like, no, the tournament organizers made a mistake. You can't, but because the Eldari Codex states that all Ynnari detachments count as Asuryani, where detachment keywords are concerned, technically this is game legal because Phoenix Lords don't have a craft world, but they do have the Asuryani keyword. So that detachment is just an Asuryani detachment, and it works. Weird. Even though they're prohibited specifically from being in Ynnari detachments, there's a way around it. So that's the basic idea for the build. Later in this video, I will talk about improvising with that more, so you have way more than 275 points to play with, but we'll start with just understanding what has been working for people. So you've got your army, and then phase 1 of the game is the Alpha Strike. Here's how it works. On turn 1, both the aircraft, both the Hemlock Wraithfighter and the Voidraven Bomber, rocket into the opponent's backfield. The Voidraven Bomber drops its once per game Void Mine on a cluster of enemy units to do d6 mortal wounds to each of them on a 4-up. If you don't play Drukhari, but you're an Eldari player and you didn't know that was a thing, right? That's a lot of damage, d6 on a 4-up. In a 6-inch circle, that's a lot. It can then either stick around to fire its Void Lances and its missiles, or you can use the aircraft roll to disappear into reserves. So you can make that initial move, bomb something, and finish overlapping a table edge, and then just disappear and come back next turn to shoot things and be safe. In many cases, though, I think it's best to keep the Void Raven on the board and enjoy the added firepower, because your opponent is already going to be overwhelmed with viable targets when her turn rolls around. So it's not like you're necessarily really getting anything by giving up the firepower and keeping it safe. And in some matchups, you will. And, you know, if you're a savvy player, you'll figure out when it's appropriate to have it duck out and when you want to keep it on the table. But I think often you're going to want to keep it on the table. The Hemlock positions itself in the middle of a large number of enemies and capitalizes on its large base to subject enemy units within 9 inches to a mortal wound on a 4-up. So Storm of Whispers does a mortal wound to everything within 9 inches. And again, the base is so big that that can potentially be most of your opponent's army, depending on what scenario you're playing. There are scenarios where they will be completely clumped up in one table quarter. And so you potentially pick up a bunch of mortal wounds that way. And then in the shooting phase, the Hemlock just wreaks havoc with its D-scythes. And the Mind Shock pod probably helps pick up a couple more enemy models in the morale phase. That gives -2 leadership to everything in the immediate area, which is pretty significant, actually. The Falcon, which I mentioned, drops in with a unit of Banshees in it who make a turn 1 charge using a Strands of Fate die and Ghost Walk, which gives you +2 to guarantee success. So if you have a Strands of Fate die giving you a 6 and you use Ghost Walk, and even if you roll a 1, the worst you can end up with is a 9. And it's become even easier to make charges out of Deep Strike now that if you're in terrain of any kind, say a ruin, the engagement range is 2 inches, so now you only need an 8-inch charge. In some cases, potentially you won't even need Ghost Walk. You can do it with just Strands of Fate. So that's pretty terrifying. The Crone Scream, the Banshee relic, does D3 +1 mortal wounds on the charge on a 2-up. And then the real pain begins in the melee phase. We all know that the Mirror Swords have become the typical loadout for the Banshee Exarch because they are objectively hotter than a Camoran tanning bed. In one early iteration of this list, though, Chase Chappelle gave the Exarch the glaive, called the Executioner, not to be confused with the Psychic Power, because with Piercing Strike, the glaive ends up doing flat 3 damage, and in a meta rife with Terminators and Tyranid Warriors, there's a lot to be said for flat 3, even if you're ending up with 5 attacks instead of 10 attacks, which is what you get with Mirror Swords and an Exarch power. The 10 attack flat 2 damage blender build is still hard to pass up, but depending on what your meta is like, you might at least want to think about that glaive variant. In addition, the Falcon that brought the Banshees in contributes some pretty decent firepower. The Pulse Laser, usually that just has a scatter laser on it, by the way, to save points, but the Pulse Laser, in combination with the weapons on the aircraft, can pop a pretty tough enemy vehicle or monster. Those Void Lances on the Void Raven Bomber, those hit pretty hard. The D-sides are no joke, even though they're only flat 2 damage. And then with the Pulse Laser, you can take out a tank. The Striking Scorpions, which deployed 9 inches from the enemy backfield using their ability, move 7 inches, and then they bring the pain in melee, including a few more mortal wounds with their Manda Blasters. Crushing Blows and the Biting Blade together inflict real damage on high toughness targets. I think most of you already know how this works, because with those 2 powers, any hits auto wound. So even though the Exarch's strength is, it's good for an infantry character, but it's against something that's T8 under normal circumstances, it would be rough. The fact that you auto wound if you just hit and then flat 2 damage, that's big. So Striking Scorpions are good against virtually any target. They're going to hit really hard. And then if the board allows, the D-cannons want to push up and do some damage. So, the notion here is maybe you deploy them pretty close to the edge of your deployment zone, ideally out of line of sight, but maybe not. And then they move their full move and they shoot the 24 inches, and that gives them a real threat on turn 1. They don't really need to worry about some exposure to the enemy, so you don't necessarily have to keep them out of line of sight. If they're targeting something out of line of sight, maybe you might as well, but if only a single firing lane on them is exposed to some part of your opponent's army, it's probably not that big a deal. Even if they're reasonably durable for their points, and even if one does die, the others then just get +1 to hit because of the Ynnari sub-faction bonus. This is going to be situational. There's situations in which you don't want to do that. But ideally, you want the D-cannons to not have to suffer the penalty to hit and the bonus to your opponent's armor save for targeting things out of line of sight. But probably on first turn, they will have to. If the initial attack is going well, we're still not done. If the initial attack is going well, when a unit dies in the shooting phase, you could have the Incarn take its place and then blast everything within 6 inches with Swirling Soul Energy, which is a shooting attack that hits automatically at Assault D6, Strength 7, -2 AP, 1 damage, and just hits everything within 6 inches. Alternatively, if things go really well, and in between the bombs and the Storm of Whispers on the Hemlock, a unit dies in the psychic phase, or even the movement phase with the bombs, the Incarn can teleport in then and cast Gaze of Ynned and maybe Smite for even more mortal wounds before making the shooting attack that I just described. Lastly, if you have the CP, there may be an argument here for this being one of those rare opportunities to make the Eldritch Storm stratagem work for you despite the face-breaking nerfs that it received. Dropping another D3 mortal wounds on 2 or maybe even 3 enemy units right out of the gate could be what it takes to really clean things up and make sure the Mind Shock pod on the Hemlock chases off survivors. In most cases, you probably won't have the CP for this, but it's worth at least being aware of. Now, in the event that you don't get first turn, you can just use Phantasm to pick up the Scorpions and either put them into reserve or position them as counterpunchers. What else you pick up will depend on the board state and your opponent's army. Just to remind those of you who are maybe newer players, Phantasm lets you redeploy up to 3 units or put them into reserve for free, but units like Scorpions that can deploy outside of your deployment zone cannot deploy elsewhere outside of your deployment zone. They have to go back to the deployment zone or into reserves because that special ability only triggers during deployment. Deployment is over. You definitely want to pick the Scorpions up if you don't get first turn. Probably, I think they're almost certainly going to die otherwise. But after that, you have options. One of the most obvious moves would be to pick up the aircraft. But in the current meta, I think that you're going to find many lists just don't have the long-range firepower to seriously threaten those aircraft on turn 1. If you position them at the very back of your deployment zone, most things will be out of range. And even if your opponent can get off shots with a couple of las cannons or something, that's probably not destroying a plane. I mean, they're -1 to hit. They are somewhat tough. The damage reduction on the Wraith Fighter certainly helps. If you do find yourself staring down like 12 Ballistari las cannons, you might want to pick them up. But otherwise, you're probably better off repositioning a unit of Rangers and maybe even those D cannons that I mentioned before that you could gamble with placing like right at the front of your deployment zone initially in the hopes that you're going to get first turn. You move and shoot. So although the order of operations I have just described for how to play that first turn with the Alpha Strike list is more or less the standard operating procedure for every Alpha Strike Unary list that's been doing well, each one has variants that also add a little bit of extra special sauce. So one of Chase Chappelle's most recent iterations includes a Shadow Seer that can rush forward on turn 1 and cast Mirror Mines on an enemy. This does another 1 to 6 mortal wounds. It does, if you succeed, it does D3, and then you start rolling off with your opponent, and every time you roll equal or higher, you do another mortal wound. You can get to 6 with this. I did it in my last Unary game. It was very satisfying. As well, a unit of Shroud Runners can be really effective because it can make, with its pregame move, 16-inch pregame move, it can then, on turn 1, definitely get into the opponent's backfield, and it has 3 scatter lasers that it can use to pick up light infantry and objective holders, while the Sniper Fire can make use of a Strands of Fate die to auto-kill a character that only barely survived the Void Mine and Storm of Whispers. At the beginning of your opponent's movement phase, the Shroud Runners then contribute additional mortal wounds by spending a CP on the Wire Weave Grenade stratagem to do another D3 mortals and impose movement penalties, which may not matter. There are other things you can do too, but the overall picture here should be becoming clear. Even if the dice behave poorly, you should be able to put about 15 mortal wounds into the enemy, and that's if things are not going well, plus an avalanche of powerful shooting and melee attacks. If the dice are a little more accommodating, it'll be more like 20 to 25 mortal wounds, and if Isha really loves you, your initial strike will plow more than 30 mortal wounds into the enemy army. The goal here is to leave your opponent with a smoking hole in her lines and some significant backfield threats that she has to deal with, but without the resources to do so efficiently, because you just pick them up. So consider also that a couple of durability boosts on your strike force, that initial strike force, can really help to dull your opponent's counterpunch. If possible, you should probably put Shield of Ynnari on the Hemlock to give it a 4++ invuln save. Combined with its native -1 to hit and damage reduction, this makes the Wraith Fighter super resource intensive for your opponent to eliminate, especially if you can shrug off one really hard hit with a Strands of Fate die, where you just auto-succeed on the saving throw. You may also want to throw Protect on an infantry unit in cover. I like Scorpions. And then set aside a CP for lightning fast reactions to make something -1 to hit. Eldar are fragile, but you can pick 1 or 2 units to make reasonably durable. That's part of their trickiness. And if this list is working effectively, it'll be really difficult for your opponent to hit you with a counterattack that levels the playing field again. Maybe she manages to bring down the Hemlock. Maybe she picks up the unit of Banshees and kills a couple of Scorpions with volume of fire, even though they have if you put Protect on them in cover, they start with a 1+ saving throw. So maybe she kills a few of those. But even still, you will be in control of the battlefield. You will be dictating the circumstances of engagement, and you will already, at the end of turn 1, be pulling ahead relatively significantly in the trading game. So that's phase 1. Phase 1 is we hurt you bad and we give you something that you absolutely have to deal with that sort of pins you in your own backfield. Phase 2, enter the Yncarne. Now, I don't want to say the Yncarne is the reason to play Ynnari, but this big bad elf demon is kind of the reason to play Ynnari. She is a super potent melee threat that knows every revenant psychic power and has nasty close range area effect shooting that we already talked about. If she doesn't enter the fray turn 1, she definitely wants in turn 2. The Yncarne can take the place of any unit belonging to either player at the moment that the unit is killed, but cannot charge on the turn that she does so. She's a great melee unit, so that's something to consider. Veteran players know that an opponent's melee phase is the ideal time to teleport her, because replacing one of your own units that dies in close combat is guaranteed to position the Yncarne within striking distance of the enemy while leaving your opponent no way to deal with it before you get your turn. So let's say, for example, that your opponent charges a unit of Rangers hidden out of line of sight in a ruin on turn 1. When those brave elf scouts give up their lives for the cause, you can replace them with the Yncarne to counterattack next turn and obliterate just about anything with a maelstrom of psychic attacks, shooting attacks, and a nasty melee profile that can shut down invulnerable saves. The Yncarne is a high skill cap unit, so that just means that if you play well with the Yncarne, it will go very, very well. But usually high skill cap also implies, like, if you're not a skillful player, maybe it doesn't earn its points. And I think that's true of the elf demon, right? The Yncarne rewards tactical play and thinking ahead. And at some point, I may do a unit focus video dedicated exclusively to how to use the Yncarne to best effect. But until I do, here are what I think are the essential suggestions. 1, sometimes the Yncarne can brutalize an enemy in melee and then teleport away before your opponent can hit back. If you have multiple units fighting first, you can trigger her to cut something with her gigantic death sword, and then if you can actually wipe out an enemy unit with your next melee activation somewhere else on the board, the Yncarne can just bamf away like Nightcrawler before her hapless victim has a chance to swing back. So that's thing number 1, teleport away before they hit you. Thing number 2, do not forget that the Yncarne can teleport multiple times per turn. If you kill an enemy unit with a psychic attack or a bombing run, she can appear in the middle of an opposing force to cast Storm of Whispers. Like maybe the Hemlock's been destroyed, so now she's the one using Storm of Whispers. And Gaze of Ynnari, as well as auto-hitting everything with that 6-inch range shooting attack that I talked about. you might not be inclined to do this initially because, yes, I mean, I'll do some damage, but then she'll just be there to be killed. But no, as long as you can kill something somewhere else on the board and shooting her melee, she can then teleport away from the middle of your opponent's army and be untouchable. And that's pretty amazing. So that's thing number 2. Thing number 3, last thing for the Incarn, we haven't already talked about it, is that the Incarn is an enormously powerful tool for objective control. If you kill an enemy unit that is alone on a faraway objective, like maybe you finish it off with your D-cannons or something, she can just take its place, maybe causing an 8-point swing in primary scoring. The same is true if one of your own objective holders is killed at range. Like you've got some scouts on a backfield objective that your opponent with a depleted army just about manages to kill. Well, she can just teleport in and prevent you from losing the point, so that you're still scoring that next level of primary points, whatever that is. So super useful tool. Arguably the single most powerful advantage in the Ynnari arsenal, and also an amazing model. It would be criminal to leave your Incarn home if you're going to run Ynnari. Okay, so phase 3. So phase 1 is the Alpha Strike. Phase 2 is the stuff you can do with the Incarn. Phase 3 actually overlaps with phase 2. This is phase 3 is what do you do for the rest of the game? And what you do is you keep up the pressure. So in order to make this list perform well in competitive play, you need to keep your opponent on her heels after the initial smackdown. And you have a lot of tools to help you do that. So those D-cannons, right? If they moved up on turn 1 and shot something, well, you can move them again on turn 2. And they're actually pretty fast for like artillery. And if you've moved them twice, they can probably target just about anything you need them to in the opponent's backfield. Ideally, you want to establish line of sight to avoid the ballistic skill penalty and the armor bonus for your opponent. But don't forget that you can also use the Resonator Shard stratagem to allow them to reroll hits against an opponent. And that, if something is within 12 inches of your scouts, which can hugely offset the ballistic skill penalty, because if you're hitting on a 4-up but then re-rolling all your misses, that's actually a little bit better than just hitting on a 3-up initially. So totally worth it. I will say that if you're shooting something out of line of sight with those that also has Armor of Contempt, it really helps to throw Jinx on it, because if it's getting a bonus from cover and a bonus from Armor of Contempt and a bonus because you're targeting it out of line of sight with an indirect fire weapon, that -4 effectively becomes a -1. So having Jinx in your army is, I think, essential. Now, anything from your initial strike force that survived that assault will probably now be pretty well positioned to hit something else next turn. Certainly Banshees will, which can advance and charge. Scorpions could have a little trouble maybe if your opponent's army was spread out in 2 big blocks in the backfield. But for the most part, you're going to be able to immediately repurpose your assault force into like a follow-up attack. You may also have additional fast target elimination units like Shining Spears that couldn't actually get into the fight turn 1, but were able to position themselves out of line of sight for a charge on turn 2. So that's something to consider. That said, keeping up the pressure does not necessarily mean going straight for the remainder of your opponent's army with everything you have. If you boxed the enemy army into a single quadrant of the board on turn 1 with no way to make favorable trades when they come out of that quadrant from behind their line of sight blocking ruin or whatever, then you might want to just keep them pinned there with threats while you score the crap out of primary and secondary objectives. Obviously, you kill anything foolish enough to poke its head out, but like, you don't necessarily have to go into the hornet's nest if you're controlling the board. So just to reiterate, pressure does not always mean killing. You can keep up the pressure without slaughtering large numbers of enemies. One of the biggest mistakes I think that new players make getting into 40k for the first time or coming back to 40k from a much earlier edition is to prioritize bloodthirst over scoring. And I totally get it. When you see your opponent's line break on turn 1 and Kayla Mensha Kane leans over and whispers like, "Get him, Ray," in your ear, it can be hard to rein in those ecstatic murder elves, but you need to remember that Kane is not renowned for his brilliant tactics, but rather for his unrestrained savagery and ineffective hand-washing techniques. In order to actually win battles, you need to be an autarch, not an exarch. So winning battles. Well, let's talk about scoring. But Brent, you might be saying, sure, your quippy little aphorism about autarchs and exarchs might sound cool, but literally the only thing you've talked about is how to kill or threaten your opponent's list. How do Ynnari rosters actually score points? And I'm glad you asked that, imaginary hypercritical future listener. Some competitive lists are designed to score points primarily by crippling the opponent out of the gate and keeping them so heavily on the defensive that they just can't score, while your own units are at their leisure to rack up the points. This is also kind of true of Hail of Doom lists. I've gotten some emails from listeners and readers who've said, well, I was listening to this thing over on the Art of War, and they talk a lot, when they talk about Elder, they talk a lot about killing. You say that scoring is the thing. Everybody thinks, I think all competitive 40K players agree that scoring is the biggest concern. But in some lists, you score by killing first. This list is designed, these Alpha Strike lists are designed to be conservative on primaries during the second turn. So you're not scoring big on primary objectives on turn 2, and then score really big when your opponent's units are depleted and or unable to escape the throwdown happening in their own backfield. It's still important to know when to box your opponent in rather than making additional suicidal trades, but aggression is the primary tool for scoring when playing an Alpha Strike Ynnari list. There are other lists where that's not true. I'm not saying that you should always play this way. But even the secondaries you select when you're running this kind of list need to be rooted in the assumption that you can keep the opponent on the defensive, because that's really determining whether or not this list succeeds. You need to be flexible about the secondaries that you pick, depending on the opposing list and the map, but I think the go-tos are behind enemy lines, scout the enemy, raise banners, hidden path, without the gate, any Killy secondary, and any Warpcraft secondary potentially. So scout the enemy and behind enemy lines have obvious synergy in Alpha Strike lists simply because those rosters are so aggressive that you are likely to have multiple units on your opponent's side of the board for most of the game. And remember that you can score Scout the Enemy for 2 points just being away from your own deployment zone, kind of in the midboard. So even in the early turns, you're picking up a few points with that. Banners and Hidden Path are good because they capitalize on how the list is already playing the primary objective game. So if there's so much pressure on your opponent's backfield that she struggles to contest more than a single point in the midfield, then she's not pulling down the banners on your side of the board. And the objective that you specified for Hidden Path, she probably has limited resources to contest. Or if she does want to contest it, she has to give up her own backfield, at which point you can probably beat her in other ways. Killy secondaries are good simply because the list is good at killing. Obviously, your opponent has to have an appropriate roster for scoring. But I will say that Chase Chappelle, if you look at some of his tournament results, even against things like CSM Terminator lists, where normally you wouldn't lean into a Killy secondary, even though the points are technically there, just because you typically win by ignoring big blocks of Terminators in many of those cases. He does not ignore them. He just kills them with mortal wounds. So sometimes the Killy secondaries are more viable than they might initially appear when you're coming up against something really tough. Just mortal wounds are hard to get around. The Warpcraft picks are a solid fallback in circumstances where one of these others isn't viable, or when your opponent has little to no psychic denial, but it's definitely not going to be a go-to the way it might be for a Children of Prophecy list or maybe an Ulthway list that can make use of the casting bonuses and that relic that lets you auto-succeed on an unmodified 9-up. But it's a solid fallback pick in certain matchups. Okay. Longtime fans of my channel or blog or both may know how hesitant I usually am to share or recommend particular lists. A big part of the fun of 40K is list writing, and I think that when we run lists that we did not write ourselves, we might miss out on part of the fun of the hobby. Furthermore, there's a high probability that we won't play other people's lists particularly well because we don't understand them, certainly not the first time. Getting better at 40K is not about having a better list. It is about developing the skills necessary to write more effective lists and then to learn to pilot them successfully. Sometimes very salty players will argue that once the list is constructed, it's like the players might as well not be at the table. It's just false. It's just false. A good list in the hands of somebody who doesn't understand how to pilot it or just hasn't played enough competitive 40K to really have the skill set is not going to be a powerful tool in the vast majority of cases. That said, I think you can learn a ton from practicing with lists that are very unlike the ones that you might gravitate towards instinctively, or lists that deprive you of your favorite units that might prevent you from learning new ways to play. If you're always leaning into, those 10 swooping hawks that keep jumping away, you might miss out on other things you can do with fast attack slots. Some of you may actually want to look up Chappelle's most recent Alpha Strike list on Best Coast pairings, or I think it might be up on Goonhammer at this point, and play that more or less unchanged. And if so, great, totally no judgment. On the other hand, others of you might be borderline allergic to the idea of playing in that list, which I totally understand. That's my natural tendency too. And if you want to improvise with more than just 250 points, I think you can strip the list down to its bare bones conceptually this way. You need the Incarn, and that's not netlisty. Every Ynnari player wants the Incarn. You need a Farseeker and a Warlock Conclave. Again, what Eldar player isn't running those units? I think the Void Raven and the Hemlock might be kind of non-negotiable, though, in this particular build, because they are the foundation of the mortal wound spam that is the Eldari Ynnari Alpha Strike. But if you just take those models I just named, you still have over 1,000 points for total customization. And I think that there are tons of things that would potentially work well here. I mentioned some of the units that have appeared in variants earlier in the video. I mentioned the Shroud Runners and there's a version with Swooping Hawks. I didn't mention that. But in addition to those, I think that there's a great argument for experimenting with melee-oriented Skyweavers that can make a 22-inch Ride the Wind move and still charge the enemy on turn 1. Maybe even an Autarch Skyrunner on the Sunstorm that can go 20 inches and charge something. That could be interesting, not only for his combat prowess, but also for the ability to enhance the Alpha Strike potential of units like Banshees or Scorpions, which are also going to be in the opponent's backfield, or even some Shroud Runners. And if you were to give the Autarch Ambush of Blades, that could help offset the mediocre AP of the Striking Scorpions and so on. There's tons of things you could do that would be different ideas. There's a lot to experiment with. Just be sure that if you try to build a Unary Alpha Strike list, you ask yourself the following questions when auditing the roster comes around. The first is, does this list do enough turn 1 damage to seriously bloody the nose of an opposing list? Because if the answer is no, and you're playing competitively, you need to rethink it. The other one is, does my strategy here rely on consistently good rolls or poor screening by my opponent? If this is only going to work if your opponent has no screening units and all of your mortal wounds are coming in the top 50% of what could happen, then it's probably not a reliable enough list for tournament play. So if you may have to tinker, but I don't think you have to run Chase's list in order to succeed. Okay, what about the rest of the triumvirate? Some of you, I'm listening to this video because I just want to play Ynnari. I don't really care about tournament play. So whenever I play Ynnari, I find myself desperately wanting to put the whole triumvirate on the table simply because the models are so freaking gorgeous. And don't let me stop you. Both Yvraine and the Vizsark have some pretty solid data sheets. The fact that the other two named Ynnari characters have not appeared in well-performing GT lists is not indicative of them being bad, but it probably is indicative of them not quite being optimal, at least in this type of build. Yvraine is 50% more expensive than a Foot Farseer, which is kind of a lot, given that she has the same number of casts and can't access Runes of Fortune. Theoretically, this is offset by her durability bonus. She's got transhuman and free rerolls on her casts like Eldred has. And she has a pretty solid melee profile, which you're also paying for. But the problem here is that most players with those Farseer slots are going to want access to Ghost Walk and Focus Will and maybe even Crushing Orb. And those Runes of Fortune powers are not available to Yvraine, but they would be available to the Farseer that she's replacing for 50% more points. She just has the Revenant Discipline, but the Yinkarn and the Hemlock kind of already have that covered for the most part. As for her durability and melee output, they are good, but frankly, they're unlikely to see a whole lot of use on the table because she's not generally a frontline fighter. And so paying more for an asset that you are generally not going to use is usually not good list design. The Vizsark has kind of a similar obstacle. The Vizsark is a decent combat character for his points, but he's slow and doesn't bring enough utility generally to justify the expense, when for a few more points you could get an entire squad of Banshees or Shining Spears that basically hit just as hard and can actually get to the target, or harder, and can actually get to the target. So if you do really want to use the Triumvirate, though, in an Alpha Strike list, you might consider sticking Yvraine and the Vizsark in a Falcon with 4 Foot Warlocks and sending them in your initial team to really mess things up. So the new 2-inch engagement range on Ruins, if you're in Ruins, melee engagement is now 2 inches, makes the charge from Deep Strike a little bit easier. If you have a reroll in your back pocket with a CP, you should be able to deliver at least one of the characters into the fray first turn. This way, you're making use of their melee potential as well as Yvraine's psychic powers. Like, she can jump out of the Falcon, do some psychic murder, and then attempt to charge. And having access to her, those Revenant powers that she would have, can be especially useful if the Yinkarn is elsewhere on the board, keeping its head down on turn 1. And understand that I am not advocating for the Vizsark Yvraine assault as the best competitive move. So those of you whose fingers are just itching to write an angry comment about how silly that is, I'm not telling you that you should do that in tournaments, but I will say that in the first iteration of this list, Chase Chappell had a Farseer and a team of Warlocks do exactly what I just suggested with considerable success. The Warlocks were getting into melee, the Farseer generally was not. I plan to at least experiment with the full Triumvirate build in pseudo-competitive games. I think it could be fun, and I think that you could actually find it doing pretty well for you. Okay, so what about the unique Ynnari Relic, Warlord trait, and Stratagem? Are they any good? Kinda. So just like each craft world, each named craft world, Ynnari, as they are basically a craft world, have access to a unique Warlord trait, a unique relic, and a unique Stratagem. The Warlord trait's called Warden of Souls, and it enables the recipient to regain 1 wound in the command phase and gives the Warlord +1 attacks and +1 strength if it's within engagement range of an enemy unit below full strength. Now, this would be amazing if you could give it to the Yinkarn, but like the Avatar of Cain, the Yinkarn cannot have relics or Warlord traits. If you're running a combat character like an Autarch, or even a Troop Master, because advance and charge, this isn't a bad pick. But now that you have to pay a CP even for the first Warlord trait, it's probably not worth it in most lists. And most people are probably not running those kinds of combat characters. But if you do, it's worth at least considering, although there may be better options. The Relic, the Lost Shroud, is a bit better. It reduces incoming damage by 1, which is good, and gives +1 to the armor save made against the attacks with an unmodified, if the attack coming in has an unmodified damage profile of 1, kind of like Thousand Suns. So the problem here is, who do you give it to? If you're taking a combat Autarch Skyrunner, which I think is like the most likely thing that you would soup in, you're better off just selecting Aegis of Eldenish if you want something that does this kind of thing, which is an Ozriani relic, which provides the same damage reduction and provides +1 to the armor save against all attacks, regardless of the damage profile, because it takes the armor save from a 3+ to a 2+. So there's no reason why you would ever give that to an Autarch. And if you're running the Vizsark or your Vrain as frontline combat characters, then you might want to think about doing it. But generally, in that situation, you're going to rely on killing anything they engage as part of some brutal first strike force. So it may not really come up, but it could be good. The Shroud could be a decent pick, again, for a Troop Master or a Succubus, but you may find you need the CP elsewhere. And it may just not increase the survivability of those relatively fragile characters to really be worth it. It's like nice if you make a Troop Master harder to kill, but not that nice if your opponent still kills it with roughly the same amount of resources. But, never say never. I can at least imagine this relic being a solid addition to the right list, or something like a Troop Master if you used it really judiciously. The unique Ynnari Stratagem, Inevitable Fate, costs 1 CP, and it provides +1 to wound for a specific unit attacking an enemy squad that is below half strength. When it is possible to use this, when that comes up, and when the annihilation of what remains of the enemy unit is not already a foregone conclusion. Like sometimes you don't want to use this if you're just definitely going to kill the thing anyway, then it's a waste. And you aren't attacking with something like Banshees that already have +1 to wound, or D-Cannons that are probably going to wound a below full strength unit on a 2-up anyway because they're strength 1 billion. In that situation, it's good. In the situation where you just ticked all those boxes, it could be especially good against a large unit of Chaos Space Marine Terminators dominating the center of the board once you've killed 5 of them. But if I'm honest, it's so situational that I struggle to remember to use it. Even sometimes before games against something like CSM, I'm like, okay, when I get to the moment, I need to use Inevitable Fate, and then oftentimes I don't remember. So in exactly the right situation, which comes up like once in 3 games, you will spend a CP on this and be happy to have it, probably. Okay, but Brent, what if I just want to play Ynnari casually? What then? Well, then you should do exactly that. The purpose of the video is not to try to persuade you to play Death Elves competitively, only to provide information and commentary on what has been working for skilled players in tournament settings. So if you're an exclusively casual player, you may want to consider cherry picking 1 or 2 ideas from this video to improve the combat readiness of your otherwise highly narrative Ynnari force. I definitely would not pull this build out with some casual player at your local game store, because not only is it kind of just maybe sometimes not fun to run your casual army against a competitive army, but like the worst matchup is an Alpha Strike competitive army, because then like your opponent gets first turn and half your army disappears from the table before you even get to play. And that's generally not what casual players have signed up for. So yeah, if you're playing casually, cherry pick a couple of ideas and then play the more narrative Ynnari list. I will say that even in casual play, trying to lean into that +1 to hit bonus for units that are below starting strength by running large squads, like a bunch of 10 elf squads of Harlequin troop infantry or something, it's a trap. It's not a great idea. With the possible exception of Wraith Infantry, War Walkers in squads of 3, or perhaps Void Weavers in large squads, the +1 bonus just rarely comes up, because Eldar are fragile. Generally, when they start dying, they just die. And even when it does come up, it's usually only good for another 1 or 2 hits. Like how many 2s if you lose some Banshees and your remaining couple of Banshees gets a roll, how many 2s did you roll, right? That would have missed, but now they're hitting. Not a lot. A big unit of Dire Avengers emerging from like a destroyed wave. So you put 10 Dire Avengers in the Wave Serpent, it explodes, one of them dies. Theoretically, they could capitalize big on this, right? Because they can pop their shoot twice stratagem. Now they're hitting on 2s. But that is not something you want to try to make happen. Like, I wouldn't take 10 Dire Avengers in a Wave Serpent and try to get it blown up so that you can do this. The +1 is nice to have when you have it, but it is not something to try to build around. Instead, if you want to emphasize the Ynnari lore and the special rules in your list, your more casual list, consider running multiple patrols so that you can soup in Drukhari Reavers and Hellions alongside Banshees and Shining Spears, Harlequin troops and Sky Weavers, which will give you a like fast, hard-hitting, unit trading oriented force that will be well balanced for casual play, and it also tells a clear story on the table. Like bonus points if you build some of your models using the unhelmeted heads included in the new Asuryani kits, as surviving the battle is just not a priority for the Space Elf Death Cult. Like, the outcome should be there's nothing left on the table at the end of the game. Pretty much all your opponent's stuff is dead. Pretty much all your stuff is dead. And those can be really fun casual games, just the bloodbaths, and you can eat some pretzels and giggle as you watch the 41st millennia carnage take place. Oh, casual play, obviously. Consider bringing the whole triumvirate. Their mere presence on the table tells a great story, and they're gorgeous models. So that's it. That's what I've got. If you are interested in learning more about Chase Chappell's Ynnari lists, which kicked off this whole new way to play Ynnari, you can hear an interview he did on the Swedish Ynnari podcast, The Reborn. You can find them on Instagram. A Google search will bring it up. I will also link it in the video description. And if you're interested in talking Ynnari further with fans of my content, you might want to consider following the link on my website to become a patron. You will earn access to my Discord and also get early access to these videos. But no pressure. There are already lots of great resources out there. So best wishes and all your creepy Death Elf exploits, and I look forward to being back again soon with new content. Take care.